Hi, welcome to Midwest Magic Cleaning. My name is Drake, no relation, and I hope you're ready to hear me talk for a really long time because we're doing the top 10 best cleanups of 2024. And as I said that out loud, I realized how extremely dorky that is. Anyway, that's what we're doing, so suck it. Number 10. I've been studying hoarding disorder since the late 1980s, early 1990s. I have cleaned up, I can't even remember, it's somewhere around 200, maybe a little bit more of these places. But I still learn things about this disorder all the time. In most cases, it's a struggle to get the people to let me throw things away, or they'll let me throw some stuff away, but they keep the majority of their hoard. And it ends up being really frustrating because they'll want to keep things that are like lids to old butter tubs that have no actual tub to go with it, or they'll want to keep a pair of pants that have been absolutely saturated by mouse waste. In this case, they actually let me throw away what I needed to, and in fact, I talked her into letting us throw away pretty much all of her dishes, and then we just bought them new pretty much everything: dishes, cups, silverware, cookware. Now, the reason that's so surprising is because there was in fact some hoarding going on here. They hoarded clothing, like a lot of clothing. They had a really bad food hoard, and they also had too many dishes and shoes. Now, we didn't get rid of most of the clothing because they do need to go through that and figure out what they can throw away versus what they can keep, and I can't make those decisions for them. However, they did let me use my discretion on pretty much everything else, and this thing took about a week to clean up. But in uncovering everything and getting rid of stuff, we started unearthing mouse nests everywhere. This house was absolutely covered in mouse poop. This house also had some very common things that we find in a lot of houses that have hoarding disorder. By the way, you'll hear me saying that phrase a lot, hoarding disorder, rather than calling them a hoarder. And the reason is hoarder is not a personality trait, it's a mental disorder. That's just a personal choice that I make because I think that calling them the word hoarder sounds like an accusation, as if they were making a choice to live like this. So for most people in this situation, this is not a choice that they're living with, it's a prison that they're trying to escape from. And unfortunately, the structure of that prison is built inside their brain. So escaping from this is not like digging a hole out of the prison, it's the escape route is tearing the prison down. But anyway, the common problems that we ran into were things like broken plumbing that couldn't be fixed because there's so much stuff piled up that a plumber can't get to it. Then as the dishes and drinks and stuff get set on the kitchen counter and then they just walk away from them, it builds up moisture from not just the food and the drinks, but also mouse urine. That stuff starts soaking into the countertops and then it just destroys them. It rots them out. The floors were in the same condition where parts of the subfloor were so rotted that you could feel it giving way underneath your feet, and that's caused by the piles. Moisture can't escape from underneath it, so it just soaks into the subfloor and just over time softens it up like a sponge. And because there was so much food on the plates and glasses in the sink and open food in the rest of the house, and because there were so many piles of stuff for the mice to hide underneath, the mice did what mice do, which is breed. They had inadvertently given them plenty of food and water and plenty of shelter and hiding places. So by the time we got to it, everything in their house was just ransacked by vermin. The other problem that we ran into was this was the middle of summer and it was extremely hot while we were doing this cleanup. And they had so much stuff that it got piled on top of the vents, preventing the house from cooling off efficiently. So as we removed stuff from the vents, you could feel the house cooling down by the minute. The irony is that actually cost them money. The air conditioner runs non-stop because the house isn't cooling off enough to trip that thermostat. So once we get everything cleared off, the thermostat can actually cool down because the house is cooling down, and therefore the air conditioner can run its cycles and shut off when it's supposed to. I would say that 15% of the places that we clean have somebody in the house on oxygen. They have really weak lung capacity. Now, the irony in this is that in almost all cases, at a bare minimum, the conditions of the house are exacerbating that problem, and in some extreme cases, they're actually causing the problem. When animal waste decomposes, it turns into ammonia. Ammonia is extremely toxic to lungs because it attaches itself to water molecules, and your lungs are just lined with water. So what can happen is, as we're cleaning, the breathing conditions can actually get worse for a few days. Then as all the dust and stuff settles down and we get all those toxins out of the air, then they find that their breathing improves tenfold. household. The thing is, a lot of doctors don't know about the condition of the house, so they're baffled as to why they're having these problems in the first place, so they just put them on oxygen until they can figure out what's happening. Anyway, we could have done much more to this house, but we would have needed another month, and we definitely would have had to have done some repairs. But overall, for us just working here a week, I think we did a pretty good job on this one, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. If we ever get a chance, at some point I'd like to go back and work there for several weeks and sit down with the family and go through all of their clothing and get rid of about 80% of it. Even if we had to take them on a shopping spree to replace clothes, I think it would be better for them overall to get rid of stuff, see it going in the dumpster, because a lot of it can't be donated. It's too ruined. But just to be able to themselves say goodbye to this stuff and physically throw it in the dumpster, I think that that's cathartic. Number 9, this house was not as bad as any of the others on the list, but it was a point of contention within the household. One partner has severe ADHD. The other partner can't control it, can't keep up with it, and is at a desperate point in their relationship. Now, I do believe there's some low-level hoarding disorder going on, but I wouldn't call it severe by any means. I think more importantly, the ADHD has gotten so severe, coupled with compulsive spending, that it's gotten out of control. And a lot of people with ADHD, they tend to live in piles. They'll put the things that they use on a kitchen countertop or a table. And if you move those things, it becomes out of sight, out of mind. They forget that they even exist. Now, this is not the way with all ADHD people. Some of them are extremely clean and have a place for everything, almost to the point of OCD. But as a general rule of thumb, most people with this disorder tend to live in piles. They jokingly call them doom piles. It stands for didn't organize, only moved, meaning that when they clean up, they move one pile from this place into another pile slightly different than the original pile it was in. Now, keeping that in mind, when we organized this house, we had to keep that disorder in mind. So I couldn't just box up a bunch of crap and throw it in the corner and call it a day. If you're gonna organize for somebody who has ADHD, you have to organize it in a way that where they can find their stuff. So for instance, if we find a bunch of office supplies, we need to put that in a box or a tub that contains all office supplies. When we were putting away old decorations, we put all the decorations together or in several boxes, but we kept the boxes themselves together. So whenever we stack those for storage, they could go right out to the garage and say, this is the box set up for decorations. Let's find the one that has the Easter stuff in it. The house itself was well kept. It was clean. We didn't have to do much actual scrubbing on it at all. It's just that the piles had gotten so out of control that they were causing clutter and causing like points of contention within the family. Now, for about half of the people who I've met with this disorder, we've ran into an impasse that has to be addressed at some point. You get about 50% of the people who say, I can't do this because I have ADHD. But knowing the diagnosis is only the first step in solving that problem. The point of view should be, okay, I understand why I do this now. I've been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, how do we figure out a plan to work with that? I would rather work with this person so that they know how to actually do this themselves. But in this situation, it was emergency enough to where I just had to go in and do it. And the way I do it is by keeping like-minded things with like-minded things. So decorations with decorations, food with food, office supplies with office supplies. But overall, this house was a challenge because we couldn't throw anything away. So we had to clean it and organize it in a way that kept their stuff but allowed them more space. So basically, this became like a whole house and a whole garage game of Tetris. Number 8, this was actually a friend of mine who had a problem with her garage. And the problem was stuff had built up over the course of 10 years. It was just a slow, gradual process of the garage becomes the storage place for stuff you don't want. And once it reaches this kind of maximum capacity, you're stuck. You either have to get a dumpster, which is hundreds and hundreds of dollars, or you have to have access to a city dump. Like, getting rid of this stuff is the hardest part, the actual logistics of finding a place to put it. So this mess is not caused by a disorder. This mess is caused by time and logistics. And I think that this is the most common mess that people who watch this channel will deal with. It may seem like I'm excusing a lot of these messes in the other videos by calling them, ADHD and hoarding disorder, but that's only an optical illusion because that's what I normally deal with. I almost exclusively work with people who have disorders, so on the channel it often comes across like I'm saying, well, it's not their fault, it's because they have this mental disorder. So I often get people who are like, not every one of these messes is because of a disorder. Some people are just lazy. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't work with lazy people. I work with people who actually need the help and are in a place where they're desperate. So anyway, yeah, that's why you'll never see a video from me where I'm like, now this person doesn't have a disorder. They're just a lazy piece of crap. We're going to help them out this week by cleaning up their crap hole. So aside from getting this just cleaned up and the mess removed, there were two main goals in mind. The first was to make sure she had a place to park her car. But the second, and I don't know if this is just a Midwest thing or if this is all the way across the country, but in the Midwest, it's really nice whenever it thunderstorms in the spring or the summer to sit in your garage with your garage door open and just chill. So she has a little seating area with a little lamp and an end table, and she'll sit out there occasionally and just relax. And she hasn't been able to do that in a long time. I wanted to make sure that we gave her that area back. Now, this happens to be one of my favorite types of cleanings to do, garages, because you can take everything out of it, clean it up, sweep it, and then put everything back, and it makes the organization way easier to do. And in this particular garage cleanup, it was really cool because she knew what she wanted to keep and she knew what she wanted to throw away. So it was super easy. She came out and said, I want to keep this, this, and this. Somewhere in here you'll find this stuff. I want to keep that. Otherwise, everything else can go. And that lets me use my intuition on what I know is valuable versus what I know is junk, and we can keep the good stuff and throw the bad stuff away. An interesting note that I don't think a lot of people understand is that it's easy to assume that garage cleanups would be the least expensive thing for me to clean because we're just getting rid of stuff and sweeping, so you don't have to worry about a bunch of cleaning products and all that stuff. However, garage cleanouts tend to be the most expensive things to clean because dumpsters, even for a small one in my area, are around $400. Mid-range is usually around $600, and a large one is anywhere from $800 to $1,200 depending on availability and where you get them. You also tend to need tubs, so oftentimes in a garage cleanout I will get at least 7 to 10 tubs. Those tend to be anywhere from $10 to $20 each depending on what they have, so that can add up pretty quickly. It's actually one of the reasons why I even have memberships on my channel, because the money that people spend for that ends up getting recycled directly into helping other people. So that pays for dumpsters, gas, hotels, cleaning supplies, all the stuff that goes into cleaning a house. You'll see 2 cleanups on this list that cost me around $3,000 in just dumpsters and supplies. If you're interested in that, I do have 3 tiers of memberships. The first one gets you access to Discord. The second one gets you 1 extra video or live stream per week, usually on Wednesdays. And there's a third tier just for people who want to help monetarily support the channel in a heavier way. There should be a join button somewhere. It's not the same as the subscribe button. That's the free one that you can just, that helps out the channel too. But if you can't find the join button, there's a link to the memberships in the description. So suck it. By the way, while we're on the subject, could you do me a favor and hit the subscribe button for me? That's the free one. And by the end of this coming year in 2025, we should be at 1 million subscribers, which will get me the gold plaque, and that's all I've ever asked in return for this channel. Last time I checked, we were at 660,000 subscribers, which is absolutely insane to me. I never expected the channel to get this big, but that's legitimately one of the best things that you can do. The easiest things you can do to help support the channel is just subscribe. Number 7, this is legitimate hoarding disorder. The main part of this hoard was clothing, paperwork. There's an insane amount of paperwork in here, empty cardboard boxes, and a massive amount of cookware. Now, first of all, the basement is the size of my entire house, so it is absolutely packed with a bunch of stuff. And the second thing is that we could only get rid of legitimate trash, though I did talk her into letting us break down and get rid of all the boxes. So the only thing that we could really do down here, aside from getting rid of the trash, and we did get rid of a massive amount of trash, was box up and bag up everything that was like-minded. I always use that phrase when I'm talking about sorting. So clothes with clothes, shoes with shoes, moose with moose, and then put all those things together. So we're not going to spread out the clothes and say we're going to put 5 bags of it here here and then 5 bags of it over there. All clothing is going to be stacked together. All old toys will be put in one section of the basement. Any live wolves that we find will be set free to frolic into the sunset because that's how they roll, son. Now here's the thing. I don't believe she knows she has hoarding disorder. She's not been diagnosed. I'm only attributing that to her because I've had decades of research and personal experience with hoarding disorder, and she meets all the requirements. She's had devastating trauma. She keeps things irrationally, and the value that she puts on her items tends to be more of an emotional value than a monetary value. There's lots of unrealized potential, meaning not potential that she doesn't see, it's potential that she puts onto an item that will never come to fruition. So I'm saving this thing for X, but X will never happen. Or I bought this as a gift to my friend, or I was going to make something out of this thing, but neither of those things are ever going to happen. And that's what makes this frustrating to friends and family who try to help, because they hear those excuses and they know that those things aren't going to happen, but they can't convince that person of that fact. So from an outside eye, it becomes really, really frustrating to the point of making them angry. But again, that's not a personality flaw. That's not a choice. That's part of the mental disorder. And for somebody who doesn't have that mental disorder, they can't think themselves into understanding it. It takes a level of empathy that most people don't have, because in order to reach that level of empathy towards somebody else, you have to completely get outside of your own body and put yourself in somebody else's mindset. That can often take decades of practice to be able to fully understand somebody else's situation. It's why certain comments will frustrate me under certain videos where I'll talk about someone with ADHD who has that type of a disorder that allows them to live in piles, and then the people will comment something like, well, I have ADHD and I don't live like that. And it's like, oh, okay, that person has a really long way to go to be able to think outside of themselves and understand what people mean whenever they talk about generalizations. They don't quite understand yet that life and people and households are not a one-to-one comparison. I think that a lot of people confuse empathy for sympathy. Sympathy is when you feel pity or sorrow for another person's situation or feelings. Empathy is just understanding. And I think that a lot of people confuse both words for excusing. I can feel empathy for her situation because I understand what causes it. I can feel sympathy for her because I know that she can't control it. Neither one of those things are excusing the lifestyle or the behavior, because once you understand your situation, that's only step one into solving the problem. It's the same as like an alcoholic. Step one is just recognizing that you're an alcoholic. You don't stop and say, oh, well, I'm an alcoholic. That's why I drink a whole bunch. So now I can just continue drinking because I can't control it. No, there's a step two in that, which is trying to alleviate the problem. How do I stop drinking, and then how do I prevent a relapse? But there should never be a point where you're like, well, I'm an alcoholic. Now I know why I'm opening this 30th beer of the day. And what are you going to do? With this specific situation, I don't believe that she's reached the first step where she recognizes that she has hoarding disorder. Now, that being said, it's not my place to come to her and say, I think you have hoarding disorder. I can express my concerns in that fashion and say, hey, you're showing signs of having this disorder. It may be worth it for you to talk to a psychiatrist or a therapist. I didn't do that in this case because I don't think she's ready to really address it. But at some point in her life, she is going to have to address it or confront that possibility, because what I'm doing here is a temporary fix for a long-term problem. If it's not addressed at some point, this will get back into this condition again. And really, whenever you boil it all down, we haven't alleviated a problem so much as we have just organized the problem into a more symmetrical aesthetic stack. Number 6, this house was really interesting because, first of all, it was built in the late 1800s, and some rooms had the original wood plank flooring. Now, unfortunately, there was extensive damage to the structure of the house, and the cost to fix that stuff far, far outweighed just building a new house. So the daughters inherited the house. They're having me clean it up, and then they're going to build a new house on that lot. Meanwhile, the mom of this house, who's elderly, had to go live in a nursing home, and the dad, who's also elderly, was so overwhelmed by the house, he finally just bought a new one and moved out. Now, this is a hoard that was really unusual because though it had the common stuff like an overload of clothing and dishes images and whatnot. Some of the hoard was legitimate. Like they had thousands of photographs, and some of those photographs were pre-Civil War era. The problem is that with hoarding disorder, there's also an extreme disorganization that goes hand in hand with it, as a general rule of thumb. So I was finding pictures from like the 1800s that was just under a pile of garbage. Their uncle's ashes were just in a tube on the floor covered up by clothing. There was at least one fire in this house. One of them came from a furnace. The other one came from a really old, outdated power strip that had caught fire, and the daughters didn't even know that when it happened. So a lot of these rooms were really covered in smoke damage and soot. Now, hoarding disorder often has a genetic component, and I know that at least one of the daughters definitely has it, though hers is not so severe that it's taken over her life. And I was going to help her out with her own situation, but when we talked and I did a walkthrough of her house, and she realized that the only solution was to get rid of like 50% of everything she owns, she definitely wanted to back out of that because she wasn't ready for that kind of life change yet. And that happens a lot when I talk to people with hoarding disorder, is they think that I'll be able to clean it in a way that allows me to restack it in order to free up room rather than get rid of stuff to create room. This house was filled with Longaberger baskets. Now that is an old MLM style company that no longer exists, which by the way, I hate MLMs. They're just a total scam. Never get involved with one of those. There's a 50-50 market on these baskets. In the Midwest, pretty much these things are worthless because everybody has them. Outside of the Midwest, they can still hold value, but when I say there's a 50-50 market, I mean that half the people who know about these say they're absolutely worthless, and the other 50% say those are really expensive, people will pay big money for them. All I know is that in my area, you basically can't even give these things away unless it's another collector who thinks they're worth something. We found some interesting stuff. I mean, outside of the really old photographs, we found an old bag that had little swatches of silk in it, and in that were little handwritten notes that said this was given to this person in 1913 for homecoming or a prom or whatever. This one was carried by so-and-so at her wedding in 1918. And there were about 6 or 7 of those in there, and each one was documented as it passed from hand to hand to hand through the years. Cleaning up a house like this is especially difficult because there wasn't a lot of trash. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that we put into the trash, but it wasn't filled with garbage and, broken down boxes and bags and, stuff like that. It was actual useful items. So because of that, we couldn't just go in there and ransack the place. We had to go through every item individually to make sure we weren't throwing away anything that was important or memorabilia or a family heirloom or actually had monetary value. One of the weirder and funnier things that I found out over the years of doing these houses is that almost every house that I clean that has somebody with hoarding disorder has a bag or a box of seashells that you're not allowed to get rid of. I also always find at least one George Foreman grill that's still in the box, and I almost always find a massive collection of unused medication. There's also always a bunch of lids for Rubbermaid tubs, but there's no tubs to go with them, as well as a bunch of old jars and like butter containers. It's really a shame that the house had to come down because it was so old. I mean, in American terms, it was pretty old. But honestly, there was so much damage to the house, both structurally and aesthetically. The floors were infested with woodworms. The foundation was crumbling. There was no real way to actually save this house. But that being said, it was really cool working in it, and it was really cool going through all the really old stuff. It was really monotonous going through everything one by one, but I think it was one of my favorite houses whenever we were all done with it. Number 5, the house that we did the basement in just a couple of numbers ago. This is their kitchen. Now, there wasn't really a huge need to do the upstairs. However, we had the time and we had the resources, so we decided to do the kitchen and her bedroom, both of which were extremely cluttered. One of the things that we see overly collected in houses that have hoarding disorder are spices, and this house had a ton of them. There were so many that we ended up going through them to get rid of everything that was past their expiration date, and there were still so many that we had to clear out an entire cabinet just for spices. It was also really overloaded with food. We did some really creative stuff to make sure the food fit, and even then we had to have separate tubs outside of her food storage so that we could keep it all together. There was just so much of it, and that was even after several days of of her mom going through this kitchen and getting rid of expired food and then taking extra food for herself. Among all the places that we've cleaned, the kitchens are the most common area that needs it, and those are typically where we start first when we're cleaning a whole house. And when they're in this bad of a condition, the best way to start is just pick a countertop and either clear that whole counter or just kind of mentally rope off 3 feet by 3 feet of a counter and clear that. If you start looking at the kitchen as a whole room that you have to clean, it's way more overwhelming than just finding 3 feet and saying, I'm just worried about this square. Then once that's done, you just go to the next 3 feet and clean it and just kind of work your way around the kitchen until it's done. As you do that, things will find their places in cabinets. Now, this one was so bad that we had to clear out old things from the cabinets in order to fit the new things into them. But this has needed to be done for a really long time. It's the inability to get rid of old things because you feel like you're being wasteful. And people will be like, well, spices don't go bad. Well, one, yeah, they do. And two, even if they don't go bad in the sense that it would make you sick, it goes bad in the fact that it loses flavor over time. So if you've had a jar of Italian seasoning for 2.5 years, that no longer tastes like Italian seasoning. And if you haven't used it in 2.5 years, what makes you think you're going to use it now? There comes a time when you have to take inventory of what you're using versus what you have and get rid of the stuff that you don't use or you haven't used in a very, very long time. And that's what this kitchen was suffering from, was just a whole bunch of stuff that could be used but just wasn't being used. One of the things that you'll notice me doing in this video is that I start putting things into the cabinets and then I realize afterwards a couple of problems. The first is that I jumped the gun and was putting things in a cabinet before I realized how full that cabinet was going to be. And the second was I had to remember that this woman who lives here is much shorter than me. I'm 6'4", so I can reach all those cabinets. She's much, much shorter, and so she'd have to have a step stool in order to reach stuff that she commonly uses. So that's a thing that I have to keep in mind when I'm organizing somebody else's house, is the functionality and the logistics of where I put things. If I'm going to put spices that are commonly used on a top shelf, it doesn't make much sense because she's going to have to constantly struggle to reach them. Now, because of those logistic type of reasons, that's why we clean every house differently. There's no like real formula to what we do, because if I'm working in a house where somebody can't walk or they're in a wheelchair, I'm going to clean that way differently than I clean for somebody who's 6'7" tall. If I clean for somebody who has ADHD and has object permanence issues, I'm going to store and sort and organize those things way differently than I do it for somebody who's neurotypical. If somebody has severe hoarding disorder, I wouldn't get rid of those spices at all until they had therapy. There's this kind of mentality that some people have, especially uneducated people or people who are uneducated in hoarding disorder, where they're like, I would just wait until they went on vacation or had to go somewhere for the weekend and then clean the whole house, and that way they can come back to a nice, clean, open, fresh house. That can send people with hoarding disorder into literal shock. There have been cases where people have offed themselves just a week or two after their house was cleaned like that, because that is not a gift to them, that's an invasion. Again, you're not dealing with somebody's personality here, you're dealing with somebody's mental illness. One of the most difficult things to deal with in a house that's affected by hoarding disorder is the amount of dishes. They are always way overloaded with cups and dishes and silverware. One of the big downfalls to this is that it's really easy to not do your dishes for a long time because you have plenty of dishes to reach for. Then by the time you've gone through half of them or even all of them, the pile of dishes is so massive that you're overwhelmed to the point to where you just freeze up and you can't take care of the problem. But a lot of the places that need my help end up having 50, 60, 100 plates. So much silverware that it barely fits in the drawer. A collection of coffee cups that could serve a church. And by the time they reach this critical mass of dishes, it becomes really, really bizarre, because now they can't throw things away because they're still useful items. And if they throw it away, they feel like they're wasting. Nobody wants their dishes because they're used dishes that belong to somebody else. So your choices are either find a place to donate them to or just straight up throw them away. If I had my own choice and full reign to do whatever I wanted in her kitchen, I would have thrown away 75% of all of her dishes. Number 4, this was one of the most difficult yet enjoyable houses that I've cleaned, and it's for a multitude of reasons. The first being that everything could go. The house was bought by a new person, and the one who used to own it obviously was affected by some pretty severe mental illnesses. Everything from depression to severe alcoholism. I believe he had some physical disabilities as well, and he can no longer take care of himself, so he's in a home now being taken care of. But the new owner had to buy it sight unseen. It was one of those where he was evicted from the house, and the new buyers aren't allowed to go into the house before they bid on it. It's like a bank repo. Another reason this was really cool for me was it was an extreme challenge because the house had no water. They turned it on and several of the sinks sprung massive leaks. There was so much damaged plumbing that we couldn't turn on the water in the house. So here in a bit when you see me cleaning this bathtub, it's mind-blowing because all I could use was just Lysol, just regular cleaners. I couldn't rinse anything. We had access to a hose that we could fill up a bucket occasionally, but like even the plumbing on the bathtub was so packed with dirt that it couldn't drain. Some of the more sucky elements of this house was there was a poop bucket in the living room, and that's exactly what it sounds like. That's actually the first of two houses on this list that had that. And I think it was just getting into the summer when we were starting this, and the mosquitoes were out so badly that they were even in the house. And so we were constantly like slapping mosquitoes and using bug spray, which didn't help at all. The house had no air conditioning, so all we could do was put a fan in the window blowing out so that as we're sweeping the place and the dust gets kicked up, it can be sucked out the window rather than resettling on the floor. There are a few questions that get asked to me all the time about this house. One is there's a guy who's helping us in the middle of it, which is a neighbor who I paid to come help us for 2 days, and he doesn't wear a mask. I eventually talked him into wearing gloves, but he doesn't wear a mask, and people were wondering why. It's because he's autistic and he just refused to put one on. He's of age, so eventually I just gave up asking him and he just did his thing. I wasn't thrilled about that either. The second is, why didn't you recycle all those beer cans? I think that we calculated there were somewhere around 6,000 beer cans in there, but to recycle those, I would have to bag them all up separately from the garbage and then drive them 35 miles to the nearest recycling center, which is in a totally different town than the one I live in, and I don't have a truck. Doing that would have added several hours of work on top of what we were already doing for free, so no, I didn't bother with it. I'm not here to save the world, I'm here to save this house. And the last question I get this a lot actually on most of my videos, is do you ever keep anything from these houses, or what do you do with it? I don't ever keep anything. This, I think, was the only house we ever kept something from, and we actually asked the owner. We found a Nintendo 64 with about 8 to 10 games, and the owner gave that to Jason. So Jason took that home, cleaned it up, and then I don't know if he ever used it or not, but he now has that. Otherwise, if I ever find anything valuable, I always give that to the owner or whoever is inheriting the house. Now, I haven't been back to this house, but I'd really like to because I'm curious as to how they fixed it, because everything was broken in here. The ceilings were caving in, the floors were ruined, the cabinets in the kitchen, the bottoms had busted out of all of them, or at least most of them. The stove didn't work at all. All the plumbing was screwed from top to bottom. If all of this stuff was out here in the open, I couldn't imagine what the ductwork looked like. I just know that it's going to take tens of thousands of dollars to renovate this place to even getting it livable, let alone a nice house that you can be comfortable in. As far as what we use to clean, anytime you're doing mass areas, I will use Lysol mixed with water because that's enough to sanitize, and it's more cost efficient because I can buy a big bottle for way cheaper than I can buy, say, a regular hand bottle of Mr. Clean's Clean Freak. I'll use Clean Freak on counters, cabinets, refrigerators, hard surface areas that don't take up a ton of space. And then for the floors and walls, baseboards, I'll literally fill up a pump sprayer with Lysol and water. I'll spray the whole place down with that and then let it set for like 20 minutes before I come back to wipe it all off. But I mean, other than that, this house was pretty simple as a process. It was just a lot of manpower and muscle power. We could literally just shovel everything up into a big trash can and then dump that in the dumpster, remove everything from the house, and then clean all the surfaces with Lysol and Mr. Clean. If there's one thing that I had to change, if I had to do it all over again with this house and then the number one house on this list, it would have been that we would have put on full protection gear over our clothing. It's easy to say that in hindsight because I'm not currently standing in a house house, it was like 104 degrees. But in hindsight, we really should have had some like long sleeve protection. But I do know that when we were in that house, it was so hot that we would have risked heat stroke. Either way, it was dangerous, and I wouldn't suggest that anybody dive into something like this without being fully educated on the dangers of it. Number 3, this was a totally different type of place because there wasn't hoarding disorder. This was the aftermath of a previous hoarder. They had long since moved out. The new people moved in, and the new people are buying it off of the old people. But there was so much damage to the house, not just from hoarding, but they also had roommates at one point that were not the most savory of people. Fortunately, they got rid of them legally, not like in a sinister way. And then the previous owners had actually had a fire in the house, which is why this entire house looks the way it does. It's covered in soot, and not just soot that you can wipe off. They've tried cleaning it over time. It's like in the actual house. So on top of just a real quick clean, because the house itself was actually really clean from top to bottom. The woman who lives there now is really good about keeping up with it. We also bought them a ton of stuff, including paint, repair stuff. We had to buy new tools in order to do the repairs. We got them curtains, a new TV stand. We got them all kinds of stuff. I think at the end of this transformation, we had spent somewhere around $2,000. But she had spent so long caring for this place and putting her heart and soul into it that they didn't have the money or the resources or the knowledge to fix the things that needed to be fixed. Now, the downside to this was that it's about 35 to 40 miles away from my house, and we were driving there every day for multiple weeks. This is actually a 4-part series combined into one, and you can find all the full videos here on the channel. But this took a lot of time and a lot of effort to get this back into a livable condition again. Now, her husband has a really long commute to his job, so he's gone a lot, and he does have an issue getting rid of certain things, but I don't think that's as much of a hoarding disorder as it is OCD. I believe he has legitimate OCD. But fortunately, he trusted the process, let us do our things, and they were both really grateful for what we did. I think that one of the most satisfying things on this entire channel is watching the ceilings get painted, because when we're first putting on that roller and you see the black disappearing, keep in mind that's just primer. We ended up doing another 2 or 3 coats of actual paint over the top of that, and every time we ended up doing another pass, it just got whiter and whiter and whiter. But I think my favorite part of the whole house was transforming the bedroom, because this was a room for a toddler, but also the mom slept in there whenever he had trouble sleeping. So they're both fans of Spider-Man. So Jason and I went to Walmart and Hobby Lobby and basically bought out all their Marvel stuff, including Spider-Man bed sheets and bedspreads and pillowcases and stuff for the walls. And it was really, really fun to be able to let loose and just do a room that had little kids' character to it. Now, this house gave us a lot of comments that were in the vein of, why didn't you fill in the blank? Why didn't you paint this ceiling in this room? Or why didn't you pull off the paneling in the kitchen? Why didn't you remove the carpet from the pantry? Why didn't you? We spent 4 weeks and $2,000 of our own money on this house. My answer to the why didn't you is that if we would have kept going and done all the things that needed to be done, we'd have been there for 3 months and spent 15 grand. We did what we did with what we had, and eventually you just have to find a stopping point and say, all right, we've given you a massive head start. Here's what I would do if I were you when you get the money to do it. Like, you may not be able to afford to replace drywall in a room or tear down a ceiling and put a new one up, but you can eventually afford, say, a $30 can of ceiling paint, and you can paint this yourself. Or, hey, the carpet in this pantry is nasty. You might want to consider pulling that up and then putting a new rug or something over the top of it. I was personally really, really happy with what we accomplished in this house, and so was that family. They were very, very grateful, and that felt super good to give them a place that they were proud of rather than a place that they were just existing in. If you want to see me going absolutely ape poop in a house and doing everything, I've been working on my house for a couple of months now, and those are the last handful of videos that I put up. Those are all my house. Yeah, if you want to see me going absolutely crazy in a place, those are the ones you'll want to watch, because that one I do have time to do, and it's my house, so I can take the time to do all the repairs it needs because I'm here. I get up in the morning and I don't have a 35 or 40 mile commute, and then the money that I'm putting in my house is my money for my house. So suck it. Number 2, this house was so bad they literally abandoned it for 4 years. This was a place where we attempted to save as much as we could, but it was so infested with mold and bugs that almost all of it had to be thrown in the dumpster. The first thing people ask is, why didn't you use a shovel? Well, one, we ended up using a shovel, and you'll see that here in this video coming up. But two, that's usually asked by people who have never tried to put a shovel into a pile of clothing. That's such a dense pile that you can't get a shovel underneath it. So the shovel just stops dead as soon as you hit the pile. So even after we get the clothing out, even a snow shovel or something big and fat like that only works if you have a bunch of small objects on the ground, like say beer cans or trash. If you have a bunch of big objects on the ground like 2-liter bottles and a bunch of McDonald's bags, the shovel's only going to grab like 3 things every time you try to pick stuff up. And so at that point, it's actually faster to pick things up by hand. Now, this room in specific, the living room, is where everybody stayed. And so any important items like old credit cards or jewelry, that's where that's going to be located. So we were a little bit careful when we first started cleaning this up to go through each item. Then once we were sure we were down to trash, then we went crazy with the shovels. This house was absolutely buried in clothing, and it had sat there for so long and had the same problem I explained earlier where it traps moisture underneath it so the moisture can't evaporate. It had sat in that so long that the clothes themselves had started to decompose the same way they decompose in a landfill. Even after we finished clearing this whole house out and getting it cleaned, there were certain areas that we did not touch because the mold was too thick. It's one thing to clean off small moldy areas with, while wearing proper masks and gloves. It's another to disturb big patches of mold that are actually furry, because at that point you can disturb it and release spores into the air, and that's when it gets dangerous. So that's when you need a professional. So when we're done, there's a shot of one of the bathrooms that has mold behind the toilet. We didn't even dare touch that. Then when she came in to see it, I told her, you can't move back in here, not until you get a remediation team in to actually professionally clear the mold out. Otherwise, you could literally die. But this was another case where I suggested treatment because this was a pretty severe case of hoarding disorder. And if you're thinking it, yes, you are right. Without treatment, this house will get back into this condition eventually. It is so rare to be able to clean up a place and then have the hoarding disorder just never manifest again. That's almost unheard of, because hoarding disorder is not the action of collecting or the desire to collect. It's uncontrollable. It doesn't just disappear when the house is clean. The house getting cluttered up and filled with stuff, that's just a symptom of the issue that lies within the brain. Now, fortunately, they had been gone from this house for so long that they had lost the emotional connection to the items. So they were totally fine with us just trashing everything. And I've been asked a lot, couldn't you have cleaned off this thing or this thing and saved it? And the answer is no. There was way too much mold in this house. There was too much rot for too long. I heard another cleaner or a psychiatrist, I can't remember which, had said, the way I think of things is, if this thing was covered in poop, would I clean it off and keep it? And if the answer is no, then it's not valuable enough and it needs to go in the trash. And that's the way I felt with this house. Almost everything was just not savable. So my philosophy is donate when you can, but don't ever give somebody something that's toxic or has been in a toxic house. That's just insanity. It's why so many people with hoarding disorder have such a rough time getting rid of stuff, because they think, well, I could give this to somebody who could use it, but they don't realize that it's sitting in a house that's saturated in mouse poop and mouse urine and mold and bacteria and fungus. And to give them that object that's been stewing in that for that long is disrespectful and dangerous. And number one, we drove a couple of hours to this house and got a hotel and stayed for a week because the conditions were so bad. I felt like this woman could actually be hospitalized by this house. This is the other place that I had mentioned earlier where we should have been wearing full protection head to toe and respirators. Now, she had told me in a DM when she asked for my help that she was like, it's covered in trash, but it's mostly just like old McDonald's bags and paper and boxes and stuff. So I don't think she truly understood how actually bad it was. The house was absolutely infested with roaches. There was a poop bucket in the living room. There was so much rot and animal feces throughout this house that it was dangerous to be around. It was so bad bad that if I would have had the money to do it, I would have thrown away every piece of furniture that she had and bought her new everything from scratch. Now, despite everything you're seeing here as far as the piles of stuff and all that, this is not hoarding disorder. I can only assume what I'm seeing is severe PTSD and probably extremely severe ADHD. Again, these are just assumptions, but I've been around a lot of people with PTSD, especially severe PTSD, and in the more extreme cases, there's a very specific tone of voice they often take on when talking to strangers, which is a very mousy, quiet tone of voice, and they're very careful and selective about their wording and phrasing. That usually comes from abuse, and they're afraid to say something that might set off somebody. I believe that she has a problem with object permanence because basically none of the cabinets had things in them. Everything was out in the open. I believe that she's of the severity of ADHD that if something goes into a cabinet, it disappears from her mind. Now, that didn't prevent me from using them because eventually she has to get used to that, or otherwise this is just going to happen over and over again. And again, it will if she doesn't get treatment for it. This house was so bad that we threw away every single dish she owned, as well as almost all of her groceries. Then we went to Walmart and bought her all new groceries, pots, pans, bowls, plates, cups, glasses, silverware, everything. It's as if we walked into a brand new kitchen and a brand new bachelor pad and said, what do we need in order to function from day to day? And we bought all that stuff. On top of that, we rented the dumpster, but before we could even do that, we had to pay her old bill that was delinquent, which was several $100s, before they would even bring a trash can out to her house. So this was the second place that we've cleaned that was a $3,000 cleanup. A common question that we get when we deal with a house like this is, what do you do about the roaches? And honestly, there's not anything I can do about them. I'm not an exterminator. All I can do is clean up the place and then hope they get an exterminator. A place that's this badly infested with roaches would be a significant bill. But you can't exterminate before you clean the house. You have to clean it first. Otherwise, the poison that they use to exterminate the roaches just sits on top of the trash and not where it's supposed to, which is on the floor and the walls. The added benefit of cleaning is that you remove their hiding places, their nesting areas, and their food source. You take away those three things and roaches can't survive. Any pest can't survive when they can't eat, they can't drink, and they have nowhere to hide. So then what they do is they retreat into the walls, and that's when you need your exterminator to come in. But the number one thing that you can do to reduce or eliminate pests like this is to clean and keep it clean. Do not allow them to have food. Don't even let your dishes sit overnight. Every night before you go to bed, do your dishes and put them away, because the residual food that's left on your plates or the residual tea that's left in your cup or whatever, that's enough to sustain pests. So take that away from them. Do your dishes, get them put away, make sure any food or crumbs that are on the counter are wiped down. The more of that you give to them, the bigger the infestation's going to get. Anyway, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I actually forgot how much work we put into these houses until I started reviewing this list and putting it together, and it was exhausting just watching us do all that work. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Just a single click on a single word here on the channel. It doesn't cost a single dime, and it helps us out so much. Members, I'll see you this Wednesday. Everybody else, I'll see you next weekend. Later.